Dad would have loved seeing all of you. For those of you who haven't seen us since we were Tommy and Mikey, just to clarify, security, I'm Tom, and this is Mike. Thank you guys for being here. Well, on June 26, 1937, at 6 a.m. on a Sabbath morning, Thomas and Evelyn Quishenberry became the proud parents of their seventh child, Philip Michael Quishenberry. Dad came after Roy, Jim, Joe, Georgia, Betty, and Pat. Baby Marvin would arrive 3 years later. Dad was delivered by a midwife in the family's home by Ocoee Hill near Ketchum, Oklahoma. Their oldest child, Roy, had been struck by lightning and died at age 17, the year before my dad was born. And so his birth helped to mend his mother's grief. About a year later, the family sold their home in Oklahoma and moved to Idaho, but they soon found that that wasn't a good idea because apparently some of the older kids were getting into mischief. And so they decided they better move back to Ketchum while the going was good. However, there was no place to live. A friend said, "Hey, you can pitch a tent on our property by the stream and you can live there." And so that's what the family did. The neighborhood kids were all jealous of Dad's family because they thought it was like camping, and the tent was so close to the stream they were able to go out and play and swim whenever they wanted.
But winter was fast approaching, so another neighbor offered to clean up their unused chicken house. So Dad's family went from a tent to a chicken coop. They were really moving up in the world. They put up cardboard partitions to make rooms and move in. Dad's older sister, Georgia, said that since this was during the Depression years, everyone in the valley was very poor and lived and worked at whatever they could to supply their family's needs. And so when Dad was 3 years old, and while still living in the chicken coop, the chicken house, his brother Marvin was born. One Sabbath morning, the family couldn't find Dad. So while searching, they saw the cows coming in and wondered why. Then they saw little Phil in diapers with a tiny stick driving the cows home.
When Dad was almost 4 years old, the family picked up again and headed west. They were told that the Yakima Valley in Washington State had lots of work opportunities for the older children since, well, the valley had apple, pear, peach, and plum orchards, plus some potatoes and other things. And there was also an Adventist school there. So the family moved to Crewport. Crewport was a newly built labor camp housing that was run by the government. And initially they moved into a communal building that they had to share with several other families. They were eventually able to move into one of the labor camp homes. It had 2 bedrooms for their family of 9. But we're actually really sure that his mom was thrilled because it was the first time in her life, or their lives, they had ever had electricity, running water, or indoor plumbing. Maybe that's why Dad became a plumber. When Dad was in grade school, his father had him help him at the labor camp. Dad would pick up and haul away the trash and help clean up the community bathrooms and showers. And I always remember how Dad would laugh when he would tell the stories about when he had to clean up the women's bathroom. See, he would announce that he was going to go in and start cleaning. But even though he did, women would keep coming in anyway. And they would just shut the stall doors, and then they would simply lift their feet for Dad to sweep under the floors under their feet. And then the women would go ahead and take showers as well, so Dad, being the dad he was, would sometimes throw ice water over the door to get them to squeal. We're actually surprised he survived those years. He also had the job to get up early in the morning to milk the family's milk cow before going to school. And he never forgot how cold those mornings were. This was about the same time that my dad got out of perhaps the only punishment he ever got out of. And the family was at dinner, sitting around the dinner table, his dad, his mom, my dad, and all the kids. And my dad said, as he was known to do, something he probably should have filtered first. His dad was not having any of it. He was upset, and he said, "Phil, go outside and get a switch." So Dad, being about 8 or 9 years old, went outside. It wasn't too many minutes, my dad walked back in with about a 3-inch switch that was just kind of limping over his fingers. Now, by this time, the rest of the kids had started to smile, but they knew they couldn't go beyond that, and the dad just got even more mad, and he said, "You go outside and you get a bigger switch." So Dad went back out and looked some more. He came back in with about an 11-inch little limpy switch for him to use. That was it. His dad was so angry, he said, "You get back in here with a big switch and don't come back till you have one." My dad looked and looked until he found the biggest switch he could possibly carry. He walked into the door, dragging it behind him on the ground. Would have killed him if he got hit with it, and that was it. All the siblings lost it. It snapped his dad out of it. He couldn't contain himself anymore and lost in laughter, and he just said, "Don't say it again." And he got out of a personal whipping the first time ever.
Yeah. By the time Dad was in high school, he was buying all his own clothes, paying his own tuition at the Adventist school, and earning his own spending money. As soon as he was old enough, he started picking fruit, but he didn't like it. That was until he tried to see how much money he could earn in one day. And then he was hooked. When he was older, a neighbor asked Dad to pick his prune orchard for him. The next day he went over, but the neighbor was gone, so Dad knew what to do. So he picked the prunes and the whole orchard and went home. When the neighbor came home later in the day and didn't see Dad, he thought he had forgotten to come because it would have taken most people many hours to pick the whole orchard. He was shocked when he checked the orchard, and he found that it was completely picked. Dad's fruit picking skills were legendary. Wait, you'll find out. In the late 50s and early 60s, when the usual wage for a man was $1 an hour, Dad would make over $60 a day picking apples. On his most epic day, he made $71.60. So here's the calculation. Each apple box weighed about 40 to 45 pounds, and he was paid 20 cents a box. So on that day, he had to have picked 358 boxes of apples. This meant that if Dad worked a 12-hour day, he was picking a box every 2 minutes. These 358 boxes at 42 pounds a box equaled 7.5 tons of apples, or 15,000 pounds in one day. So on that day, he made the average, what would have been the average week's wages for most people. So,
Dad's sister George and her husband George, his sister Georgia and her husband George Randolph, they invited Dad to live with them in Loma Linda and to go to Loma Linda Academy starting his sophomore year. Dad loved Loma Linda and never wanted to move back to the Northwest because he remembered those cold, cold winters. He always said he thought he had died and gone to heaven. So from then on, he lived in Loma Linda and only went back home to pick fruit in the summer. When Dad came to live with Georgia and George, they only had their first and oldest daughter, Connie. 2 other daughters, Kathy and Karen, who are here today, were born after he joined the family. So for many years, Kathy and Karen just thought my dad was their older brother. Dad graduated from Loma Linda Academy in 1955. He was Student Association President and Athlete of the Year his senior year. Dad would help George in the summers during high school before apple picking season in Washington. And between his junior and senior year, he worked with George to help build the Loma Linda University Dental School. And for fun, he would also join the local fast-pitch softball teams in Loma Linda and La Sierra. Our dad absolutely loved playing fast-pitch softball.
after high school, he went to Walla Walla College. Mom was a sophomore at Walla Walla College Academy, which was on the same campus, but they never met. To pay for college, Dad worked nights about an hour away at Harris Pine Mills in Pendleton, Oregon. He worked 40 hours a week. This schedule made college extremely difficult. He would regularly fall asleep in chapel, and so he simply couldn't keep up that schedule. Dad was drafted into the Army in 1960 and served for 2 years. But 6 months before he was to be discharged, his medic unit was called to go to Vietnam. This was unusual because the military didn't usually take soldiers to Vietnam who had less than a year to serve. But Dad's sergeant also loved softball, and Dad was the pitcher on their team, and so he took him anyway. They set up the first field hospital in Vietnam before the conflict had ramped up for the American GIs. So Dad was able to ride his bike, go snorkeling, and of course, play ball after work. One day, Dad's family was watching CBS's Wide World of Sports and was surprised to see him playing softball in Vietnam. His team happened to win that tournament. So.
Dad was an absolute beast as a softball player. We, as kids, had matching uniforms to the team. I was 0, Mike was 00.
Still
My mom made those uniforms and we wore them proudly, and I still remember watching my dad. He could pitch it near 100 miles an hour and was known to hit home runs in Redlands out of the park, across the street, and land them into the local McDonald's. After returning from Vietnam, Dad met Mom on a blind date where they actually went bowling. Now, Dad was a very good bowler and had bowled perfect games, and he was very, very athletic. But Mom says she was not athletic and she was a terrible bowler, and she made several gutter balls on their first date. But that didn't seem to matter to Dad at all. After they started dating, and for many years into their marriage, Mom loved to go and be a spectator as Dad would bowl with bowling leagues or play on softball teams throughout the summers. While they were dating, Dad would often describe Mom to anybody who would listen as a combination of Ellen White and Florence Nightingale. We always laughed about that.
Dad and Mom got married on May 3rd, 1964. While dating, they both lived in Loma Linda, where Mom worked as a dental hygienist and Dad was a plumber. But since Mom grew up in Milton, Freewater, Oregon, and her family was still there, and my dad's family was in the area as well, they chose to go to Oregon to get married, but not without complications. 6 days before the wedding, Dad was working with George on the new men's restroom right here at the Calamasa Church. It's the restroom right across from the social hall and is now the women's bathroom. While he worked there was a flash butane gas explosion right beside him, and Dad ended up in the ICU at Loma Linda Medical Center with first-degree burns on his face and second and third-degree burns on his neck and right arm. Dad convinced the doctors that he was still well enough to get married on Sunday. So they discharged him on Thursday with very specific instructions: fly to Walla Walla. So, of course, Dad left the hospital Thursday late that afternoon and got into the back seat of George's car. And they headed to Oregon, driving all night and arriving on Friday morning. When they arrived, the whiskers on Dad's face had pushed through his loose scabs. So he pulled them off and shaved his tender face before Mom arrived so she wouldn't see his scabs and they could go get their Oregon marriage license. They honeymooned in Hawaii, taking supplies so they could bandage his arm daily. They did not spend time at the beach. Hawaiian sun and third-degree burns just don't mix. For the next 58 years, Dad would brag about Mom. He would tell people what an amazing person she was. He would wax eloquent about her many talents and how she could do anything, how smart she was, how she was such a hard worker and an amazing mother. And of course, he would speak in raptured tones as he shared about her incredible cooking and baking gifts. Dad would beam whenever he talked about Mom.
Dad and Mom made their home in Loma Linda. They lived in an apartment for 4 years, and during that time, they added 2 amazing, adorable, brilliant, perfectly behaved, precious, and continually astonishing baby boys to the family during that time.
This was independently verified.
Our family then moved into our starter home in 1968 when I was 21 months old and Mike was 7 months old. The home cost $22,000. But Mom wanted to actually have a different house originally. But Dad said they could never afford it. It was so expensive. She wanted a house that cost $32,000. So they didn't get that one. They got the $22,000 home. Now, after 54 years, Mom still lives in their starter home. While Dad was busy working 60-hour weeks, he always made time to take care of the yards, wash the cars every Friday so they'd be spick and span for Sabbath, and spend time with his family. After a long day, we'd often find ourselves roughhousing with Dad on the family room floor, playing hours of catch and batting practice in the front yard, and every Thursday for many years, going to Baker's drive-thru for Dad night. And several times a year, Dad was able to take some weekend time off to take our family to Joshua Tree National Park, where he made some of our most lasting memories. And he never missed one of our varsity games.
Dad worked as a plumber for his brother-in-law, George, at Randolph Plumbing until George retired. George would get jobs all over. Some of these places were the Navajo Nation in Arizona, Glen Canyon National Recreational Area in Page, Arizona, the Naval Base in San Diego, San Pasqual Academy near Escondido, Laguna Beach, several other beach towns, and many more. Then locally, there was Loma Linda Hospital, the Towers, many custom homes in Covina and the San Bernardino Valley, and lots of maintenance jobs. When George was ready to retire, Dad bought the business and worked by himself for several decades. Dad and a local electrician would often debate about whether electricians or plumbers were smarter or better looking. While eating lunch, the subject of gravestones came up, and they talked about how they wanted to be remembered. And the electrician said, Dad said he wanted his gravestone to say, "At least I wasn't an electrician." Apologies to all electricians out here. In the years that followed, Dad and Mom enjoyed finally getting to travel more with family and friends. Dad and Mom loved their Alaskan cruises, going on long weekends to Cambria and taking family trips to the Mendocino coast. He absolutely loved his family and couldn't get enough time with his 5 grandkids, Bailey, Jamie, Kiko, Drew, and Shawnee. He said being with them was a slice of heaven.
Dad retired completely when he was over 70 years old, and really because he had to. His neuropathy was getting worse, and it drained him of his energy, and he was having a hard time carrying his 90-pound toolbox up the stairs. It had come time to finally close the business and sell his iconic little blue Toyota work truck that seemed to barely fit around his huge frame. One of his customers would often say, "I loved Phil. He could fix your faucet, update you on the community gossip, give child rearing tips, and share the love of Jesus, all for one price."
In February of 2020, just before the pandemic shut things down, Dad lost all his energy and felt best just reclining in his chair. The neuropathy was still getting worse, and he had pain in his back and shoulders from years of injuries. And even with a high tolerance for pain, he didn't like to complain, but it was definitely taking a toll on him. He took care of all of his personal needs, but was getting much more unstable when he walked. Then on July 20, 2021, while shaving, he got dizzy, fell, and broke his hip. After surgery, he went to rehab, but between his neuropathy and back and shoulder pain, he just couldn't do it. So 3 weeks later, he went to the Rest Haven Care Home, where he had a private room with his own outside entry. He was happy just to lie in bed, watch TV, especially baseball, read the newspaper, and do his daily word search with Mom. Luz and Nellie went above and beyond, giving him wonderful and excellent care for 14 months, until he went to sleep peacefully on September 28, 2022, waiting for the resurrection morning.
Well, when we all get to heaven, we're going to know my dad is there. And here's how. You're going to hear a crowd cheering for another home run he just hit over the sea of glass. You're going to hear laughter as he tells hopefully appropriate jokes to the disciples. And you're going to see him arguing with Peter to see who has the toughest calluses and whether fishermen or plumbers are better looking and smarter. He'll be standing with Mom by Jesus and bragging about her desserts and making some joke about how the Israelites really would have grumbled less in the wilderness, Jesus, if you had made manna taste more like her cookies. Oh, and the tree of life? It'll be picked clean in less than an hour.
We're so looking forward to that day. It can't come soon enough.
We love you, Dad.